Eden, and welcome to my super epic Honors 315 final. Get ready for a journey you never dreamed possible, featuring evidence nicely compiled into an aesthetically pleasing spreadsheet, tweets, scholarly opinions, and statistical analysis of boobs, butts, and purposeful nudity. You pumped? So here's the thing. First and foremost, I was drawn to Poison Ivy, the DC villain, for a number of reasons. The first of which being she seemed like a character who used her sexuality for herself. And I've always been drawn to characters who own who they are and aren't afraid to use their sexuality. I think in a lot of media, a female's sexuality is used to supplement the male gaze, and that's a whole other problem in and of itself. I knew sexuality was going to be a big part of my research because you can't really deny a fiery, red-headed lady walking around in a foliage-clad leotard. Obviously, we kind of need to address that because a lot of people would argue that by representation alone, there's no way she could be feminist. She's obviously just created for the viewing pleasure of men, and to an extent, I see their point. I mean... However, my first encounter with her was in Poison Ivy's Cycle of Life and Death, which is a comic that showed me that there might be a case for the other side. She's this brilliant woman in STEM. She's a vital character type that's so beneficial for readers to see. She doesn't apologize for who she is, and she doesn't put up with anyone mistreating her or anyone else. It's very promising. And honestly, I got one issue in and knew two things for certain. One, this is my new favorite comic book character, and two, I have to research her more and see where she came from. Thus, bringing us to now, and why you're watching this video. Welcome to Finals Week, everyone! The research question I'm going to be tackling is, does the DC comic villain, Poison Ivy, possess feminist values? The corpus I tackled in this research was the first issue she appeared in Batman, which is issue number 181, which was written in 1966, and the entire run of Cycle of Life and Death, which is 6 issues long, the 2016 run of Batman, issues number 41 through 43, and the whole run of Gotham City Sirens, which is 26 issues. So all in all, I looked at 36 issues of various comic books with Poison Ivy in them. I never thought at some point in my life I would be combing through the pages of a comic book looking for boobs and butts and weird sexual body positioning and framing and trying to determine if the nudity was fan service or purposeful. And yet, here we are. Now, I looked for very specific things in my corpus. I looked at how many pages Ivy was just straight up nude, how many times she was in provocative poses, the number of times she shut down misogyny, when there was sexual imagery or symbolism, when people underestimated her due to her gender or appearance, and when other characters put too much value on her looks. I feel like I should explain what provocative poses mean, because there are specific things I'm qualifying as provocative. In an article I read by Kristen Race called Batwoman and Catwoman, Treatment of Women in DC Comics, she brings up some criteria that I was careful to look for. 1. A frame isolating a singular part of a woman's body. 2. A shot of just a woman's torso without a head. 3. Framing where both her breasts and her butt are shown at the same time, a phenomenon Race refers to as an anatomical impossibility. Race even brings up the fact that while male characters also suffer from particular framing issues, they often highlight the mouth, the fist, or the weapon. I think demonstrates the clear intention of depicting action and violence and strength with male characters while commoditizing and hypersexualizing the female body. The other term I'd like to define is what I mean by sexual imagery and symbolism. One particular instance that made me add this to my stats was a frame where Ivy is standing under a plant she's cultivating, and the frame is looking up her skirt, and she has her hands out, and a plant is dripping liquid. That just seemed too blatant of sexual imagery for me to not do a double take, you know? And then you start to notice all the women tied up, which lends itself to a sometimes not so subtle representation of the BDSM community. Race even touched on this in her article, noting that female characters in DC usually have weapons that slow down their enemies, but don't actually hurt them. The examples she gave were Catwoman's whip and Wonder Woman's lasso. Even their weapons are sexualized in some cases. Like, are you kidding me? Anyway, here's my chart for Batman number 181. As you can see, the only high scores on this spreadsheet are for provocative poses and her looks being overvalued by others. Now, let's be clear. We're talking about 1966 provocative poses. It wasn't too crazy. More than anything, people just kind of incessantly talked about her good looks, which made her as a character feel very one-dimensional. It felt like every other second someone was commenting on how pretty she was, and she was using her looks as a way to seduce herself through situations. Now, this was interesting because the time period in which this was made informed a lot of how she used her looks. Yes, she was seducing people, it's Ivy, but it was a much more restrained, I'm a pretty girl and I'm gonna distract you kind of way, you know? It wasn't nearly as sexualized as it is today. It was like a neat little time capsule. Next we have Poison Ivy, Cycle of Life and Death. By far, the highest ranking category was provocative poses. I have so many screenshots saved on my computer of her in provocative poses throughout this run, it got kind of ridiculous. There was also a nice helping of sexual imagery and symbolism. Story-wise, they gave Ivy a lot to work with in this comic. We got to see her use her powers in numerous settings and use her sexuality in a way that wasn't demeaning. Now, I'm not going to pretend like she wasn't completely nude with some carefully placed plants in frame, because that totally happened, but she didn't rely on her sexuality in every encounter to bail herself out. However, I did start to notice more of what was mentioned in Amber Morrison's article called Understanding Gender Identity Among Women Cosplayers of Gotham City Sirens. We're gonna get to GCS later, but this article interviewed people who had cosplayed as the characters from that comic. And something that drew my attention was the cosplayer who dressed as Ivy and defended her lack of clothing. I'm gonna read her whole quote because it's all really important. She's all about being closer to nature, and what's closer to nature than being practically naked? She doesn't really care what she looks like, and she feels great. She is definitely overly sexual. This can cause a lot of problems when cosplaying her, because there are men in the nerd geek community who seem to think that when a woman cosplays certain characters, she's asking for the perverse and downright creepy attention. A lot of the time, they're objectifying me, and they get angry when I don't like their advances. I don't want to feel shunned or uncomfortable because of some creeps who think they own me when they really don't. Well, yes, obviously, this girl is like wearing nothing. We can't dismiss the fact that this idea that what you're wearing dictates how you should be treated, or in this case, perceived. People arguing that she isn't feminist immediately focus on the fact that she's in a leafy bathing suit without acknowledging how powerful she really is and what her story is about. let's talk about that because the public has some thoughts on it. There's this one tweet that I thought perfectly captured the deeper side of Ivy's story. She's a metaphor! Guys, okay. So her backstory, the most popular one is she was seduced by this guy, Dr. Woodrue, and he injects her with this serum and then she gets all her poison ivy powers. She was working with him and he took advantage of her and then stuck a needle in her, guys! And then she turns into a villain. And honestly, this theme of isolation and everything that the tweets touch on is common in lots of Ivy pieces. Sometimes she purposely isolates herself from humans, but she was hurt. So yeah, I can see why that's her knee-jerk reaction. She just wants to keep herself safe. She isn't just some man-hater. And are we going to talk about this whole idea of woman as a temptress that's been around for ages? Like, ugh, I'm so sick of that narrative. I can't. That's why her sexualization is used against her in arguments that are anti-feminist about Ivy. Because for so long, women have been depicted as the transgressive temptress that must be punished or domesticated. That's how Race describes it. Domesticated! People are mad and I am one of those people. The 2016 run of Batman, issues number 41 through 43. Now, this one is interesting because she had a totally different character design. So, not only is she crazy powerful, but she's also clothed. So, there! Clothing! What I love about this comic is how vulnerable Ivy was. This is the Ivy we're talking about. She's been hurt, people, so badly, and she's vulnerable and so perfectly human. Despite being a hybrid plant human, she depicts such raw human emotion in this comic, and it really moved me. I think it really helps the reader understand that people don't just become villains for no reason. Everyone's a little broken. Does that mean go off and become an all-powerful eco-terrorist? No. No, it doesn't. All I'm saying is there's a much deeper wound here. There's a person with feelings. This brings up another point that I want to make, that her backstory is different depending on the creative team, but on an article I read on Sci-Fi, they covered the backstories more, and I just think it's important that we cover those. It said that in one run, her father physically abused her mother, and that led to her death. Then later, we get to the Woodrue storyline of abuse through experimenting on her and the emotional manipulation he put her through. And as stated in the article, ever since she first appeared, she shows up almost exclusively to be tormented by every male character she encounters. Sarah Century goes on to also talk about how, in one account, she's sexually assaulted by men in her workplace. So, no, she isn't a man-hater for no reason. She's been traumatized by men. So, naturally, there's a distrust there. This conversation was spurred by the circulation of the hashtag #SavePoisonIvy. This arose in response to a leaked Heroes in Crisis cover that was just too much. Fans were outraged. This cover was obviously in bad taste. The framing, the position she's in, the amount of blood depicted was just too much. And it was redacted by DC, but it wasn't soon enough. She means a lot to people. Her story, what she stands for, what she's lived through, and to have her meet an end like that just wasn't in good taste. The hashtag continues to get more and more posts as people call out DC for their treatment of a feminist icon like Ivy, and their treatment of women in general, honestly. H. Gotham City Sirens, issues number 1 through 26, the whole run. "44 provocative poses." 44! Now, one thing I will say about GCS is that in this run, Ivy shuts down misogyny the most out of any comic I read, and it's refreshing to have a comic with an entirely female main cast. Seeing a female dynamic like this was really cool because they didn't depict toxic female relationships. Now, these girls are villains, so obviously they have instances of not being good to each other, but the comic didn't descend into, like, catty girl behavior that is in media all over the place today. Each woman had their own personality that was complex and unique to them. They responded to problems in different ways, and they had conflicts that went beyond the surface. Ivy's connection to the plant life in this comic was really important too, and it was used as a really clever plot device, because obviously these are the powers that she has, but they almost became even more vital in the plot of this comic in particular. I feel like they made her more powerful, but they kept her on par with the other women in the comic too, so she didn't feel overpowered. And in this rendition of her, Ivy just oozed power and confidence, and it was amazing. Let's circle back. All this, does Poison Ivy possess feminist values? Absolutely! This lady has been to hell and back. For many people, she represents recovery after abuse. She doesn't let people underestimate her, and her sexuality is her own. There's no doubt in my mind that this woman is a beacon of empowerment. Yes, she's scantily clad, although not in every rendition. Most of them. But her clothing doesn't dictate who she is or what she stands for. Is she the perfect depiction of feminism? No. Maybe not. But I don't think there really is one yet. So, you know what that means? One of us is just gonna have to